All right, week 2, conflict in North America. I'm going to start by talking about the South, and then I'm going to do a second section on the North. So, here we go. Building empires and colonizing peoples in the South. Who's that? Now, I'm sure you know the image on the right, Disney movie Pocahontas. The image on the left is actual Pocahontas. You can see how different they look. So I want to open today's class by telling you all about Pocahontas, and not the Disney movie Pocahontas, but the actual young woman and her life. Pocahontas was born in 1595 and was about 12 when Jamestown was founded in 1607. The portrait of her you see here was done in 1616, 1 year before her death. This was done for the Virginia Company as a way to promote the English colonization and civilization of native peoples. What the portrait doesn't depict is the many tattoos she had on her face as part of her native culture. The English wanted Pocahontas to appear as assimilated as possible. The daughter of Powhatan, it was believed that she saved the life of English Captain John Smith in 1607. Historians now believe that it was probably part of an elaborate ceremony designed by Powhatan to demonstrate his power over the colonists and incorporate them into his realm. Pocahontas subsequently became an intermediary between the two peoples, bringing food and messages to Jamestown. In 1613, while visiting the Patawomeck Indians of northern Virginia, Pocahontas was lured aboard Captain Samuel Argall's ship and held captive. Argall, an English navigator and administrator, had, quote, resolved to possess myself of her by any stratagem that I could use, for the ransoming of so many Englishmen as were prisoners with Powhatan, as also to get arms and tools, and some quantity of corn for the colonists' relief. She was taken to the governor at Jamestown, and during the year she was held captive, she was converted to Christianity and baptized. She adopted the Christian name Rebecca. Her conversion was celebrated as a victory for the Virginians and their missionaries. Little is known about her marriage to John Rolfe, taking place in 1614 when she was 19 years old. Her father consented to the marriage as a way to cement ties between the two groups and restore peace between them. After traveling back to England, she caused a sensation in the court of James I as a symbol of Anglo-Indian harmony and missionary success. The Rolfes were set to return to Virginia, but Pocahontas never made it back and died in 1617 during the journey. She was about 22 years old. The most prevailing theory is that she died of smallpox or some other European illness she contracted when she went to England. Legends and retellings of her story sprang up not long after her death and continue to this day. There is a monument of her in Jamestown. The figure is a woman of perhaps 18 or 20 years instead of the girl of 12 or 14 who visited the settlers when John Smith was there. She wears clothing more befitting a Western Indian than a Powhatan. The peculiar sandals on her feet are as unknown to her culture as the most Art Nouveau floral design incised on her vest, both of which are visually appealing but wholly inaccurate. So I want you to think about, now that you know what her life was like, think about why her story has been rewritten in the ways that it has. Why does this revisionist history exist, and what does it say about colonization? Right? Is it easier to make her a symbol of Anglo-Indian harmony? Certainly back then it made more sense, right? You could recruit more people to go to the New World by depicting the natives as easily assimilated, right? But it's also this attempt to rewrite Native history that I did talk about a little bit last week as well. So I want to make sure you guys think about that going forward. As we will see, there are different types of colonialism. What the Spanish engaged in is called empire building. The goal is not to populate the area with a permanent settlement, but to extract resources for the wealth of the empire, in this case, Spain. While the Spanish Empire centered on Mexico, Peru, and the West Indies, The hope of finding a new kingdom of gold soon led Spanish explorers into territory that now forms part of the United States. Multiple expeditions to Florida occurred in the early 16th century, but it wasn't until the 1560s that the Spanish began lasting efforts to settle the area. After destroying a French outpost and killing the settlers who had lived there, nobleman Pedro Menendez de Aviles established Spanish forts on St. Simon's Island in Georgia and St. Augustine in Florida, the second of which being the oldest site in the United States continuously inhabited by European settlers and their descendants. Spanish expeditions soon established forts from present-day Miami into South Carolina. Spanish missionaries set up outposts hoping to convert natives to Catholicism. Several of the forts fell into disuse, and many of the missions were destroyed by local Guale Indians in an uprising that began in 1597. So again, forts, right? Not permanent towns or villages. That does happen with the Spanish, but it's not their drive, right? Empire building does not require establishing permanent settlements as its main focus. Okay, their main focus is to extract resources. The natives explained their revolt and that the missionaries wanted to eliminate, quote, our dances, banquets, feasts, celebrations, and wars. They persecute our old people by calling them witches. Florida failed to gain large numbers of settlers and in 1763 had only about 4,000 people of European descent. The Spanish also expanded into the southwest. After a series of failed ventures, similar to the early expeditions in Florida, Juan de Onate led a group of 400 soldiers to establish a permanent settlement in 1598. After Onate's nephew and 14 soldiers were killed by natives in Acoma, Acoma, a city in present-day New Mexico, Onate retaliated in a 2-day siege that laid waste to the city and killed hundreds. The women and children who were captured were placed into servitude, while the men each had 1 foot cut off as punishment. Onate's message was clear. Anyone who resisted Spanish authority would be crushed. In 1606, Onate was ordered home. His failure to find gold was a disappointment, but his treatment of the natives led to his own punishment by Spanish royal authority. This was rare. In 1610, Spain established the capital of New Mexico at Santa Fe, the first permanent European settlement in the Southwest. Okay, right? So they came in the 1500s. We saw them with Cortez and Tenochtitlan, right? So it's not until the 1600s they established a first permanent settlement. Again, empire building, very different from what we're going to see the English do. And I want to point out that Onate's reaction to 14 soldiers and his nephew being killed is a pattern. This happens over and over again, where there's a siege by Native Americans and then the colonizers come back with this huge, huge attack that dwarfs completely what the natives did. So I want you to just notice that that's a pattern. And you can probably hear my cat trying to also get in on the conversation. All right, so next I'm going to talk about the Pueblo Revolt. Santa Fe became the centralized point of European life in New Mexico, and the area stabilized as the 16th century progressed. However, by 1680, New Mexico's colonial population was still small and vulnerable, numbering around 3,000. Most were mestizos, persons of mixed Spanish and native origin, since few European settlers, especially women, had come to the region. As governors, settlers, and missionaries continually sought to exploit the labor of a declining native population, relations between the Spanish and Pueblo Indians began to break down. Franciscan friars often used intimidation and violence in attempts to convert the Pueblo to Catholicism. Some accepted conversion, while also holding to their older religious and spiritual beliefs. But as the Inquisition became more intense in Spain, so did the friars' attempts to stamp out traditional religious ceremonies and practices. The burning of masks, idols, and other sacred objects belonging to the Pueblo alienated them in larger quantities than it created conversions. A prolonged drought that began in 1660, along with the Spanish's inability to protect the inhabitants from raids by Navajo and Apache Indians also added to discontent. The Pueblo themselves had been divided, and colonial authorities assumed they would never unite against the Spanish. In August of 1680, they were proven wrong. Little is known about the Tewa man named Pope, who became the main organizer of an uprising that aimed to drive the Spanish from the colony and restore the natives' traditional economy. Now, for some reason, the copy that I'm holding doesn't have the accent on the end. It just says Pope, but Tewa man named Pope, if you're looking at the lecture notes, there should be an accent on that last E. And I had put it in there. I'm wondering if it didn't print since it's a special character. But just FYI, there is an accent on that last bit. A religious leader born around 1630 in San Juan Pablo in present-day New Mexico, Pope first appears in the historical record in 1675, when he was one of 47 Pueblo Indians arrested for sorcery, that is, practicing their traditional religion. After being publicly whipped in Santa Fe for his crime, Pope returned home and began holding meetings with Pueblo communities. Under Pope's leadership, New Mexico's Indians joined in a coordinated uprising. Ironically, because the Pueblos spoke 6 different languages, Spanish was the common language used for the revolt. After 2,000 warriors destroyed isolated farms and missions, they surrounded Santa Fe. The Spanish resisted for a time, but had to flee the town. Within a few weeks, a century of colonization in the area had been destroyed. The Pueblo Revolt was the most complete victory for Native Americans over Europeans and the only wholesale expulsion of settlers in the history of North America. They destroyed all markers of Spanish rule, including fruit trees, cattle, and churches. Some waded into rivers to wash away their baptisms. They then built their traditional places of worship, right? They rebuilt them and resumed sacred dances the friars had banned. The cooperation soon evaporated, and by the end of the decade, the Pueblo peoples were warring against one another. Pope died around 1690, and in 1692, the Spanish invaded and reconquered New Mexico. In the 18th century, colonial authorities adopted a more tolerant attitude toward traditional practices and made fewer demands on Indian labor, lessons they learned from the defeat of their Spanish predecessors. I'm going to talk about the English, and I want to explain their colonization. And this is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to explain it at the end of this part. I'm going to re-explain it at the beginning of the next part, so you're going to get it twice. Alright, so early Jamestown was akin to Spain's empire building, but that changed in later decades, and with the settling of New England. Okay, the English practiced settler colonialism. I've already touched on this when discussing the European attempts at replacing natives as the indigenous peoples in America. Okay. In settler colonialism, the idea is not to temporarily settle or extract wealth from the colony. Instead, the goal is to permanently live in the area and take lasting ownership over the land and resources. So picture a garden like the one here. The Native Americans are flowers growing in that garden. In settler colonialism, the English pull the flowers out of the ground, revise the history of the garden, and plant themselves in the flowers' place. Now the garden grows the English as though they've always been there, as though they are native to that garden. Through history, legends, and storytelling, the original native flowers are erased, and the English people's place in the garden is cemented. That is settler colonialism. So I'm going to end part 1 here, and I'm going to open part 2 with re-explaining this, because I know it's a little bit tricky, a little bit complicated. Make sure that we get it multiple times and you guys have a better understanding of it.